The Founding of Concarneau. Previously on, Vizier Tam's caravan tore through the mist to the sound of drums and hoofbeats, not as an encounter, but as a destiny fulfilling itself. Helena was mistaken for a sacred presence, and the court received her in reverence, while Alexander understood that diplomacy and fate are at times the same force wearing different names. At the banquet, alliances were sealed with more than words. Makeda, daughter of the Grand Mansa, chose the sea over the throne. The moonlit oasis was surrendered as a living covenant between the desert and the ocean. The two vessels sailed northward together, crossing currents that appeared on no chart, listening to the first lights of Thule singing on the horizon, until a new land emerged from the mist. There, where the river kisses the sea, the first sacred port was born, Concarneau. In this new episode, we will discover together how a fog, denser than any morning ever witnessed, will guide Alexander, Helena, Makeda, and Amina through a delta that seems to breathe, as though the land itself were waking specifically to receive them. We will witness the birth of Concarneau not merely as a shelter, but as an ancestral covenant between the ocean and memory, sealed with the symbol of the sun intertwined with the star, raised by the hands of men and women who learned that to take root is also a form of courage. We will see the first ordeals, the rain that destroys, the mud that tests, the heart that hesitates, putting to the proof not only Alexander's leadership, but the bond uniting such different souls around a single purpose. And as the sacred port takes shape between effort and dream, we will hear the call of the sea return, not as nostalgia, but as prophecy. For Concarneau is not the end of the journey, it is the beginning of something that has no name yet. The dawn of the mists and the call of the delta. There was something wrong with that fog, not the kind of wrong you can name, the kind you feel on your skin before you even open your eyes. Dawn arrived wrapped in heavy silence, as though time itself had held its breath, refusing to reveal the new day until someone asked the right question. The camp slept beneath the murmur of the river, and the cold sand of the shore preserved, pressed into it with strange precision, the marks of footsteps no one remembered taking during the night. Alexander woke before the others, driven by an instinct he couldn't have explained. He lit the fire with slow, deliberate gestures, dropped camellia leaves into the embers, and stood watching the tea's steam rise in spirals that twisted the wrong way, as if the wind were blowing from the inside out, as if the earth were breathing. Helena was the first to notice the delta. Wrapped in her pale wool cloak, motionless before the misty horizon, she wasn't looking at the river, she was listening to it. The fog moved with intention, dense and alive, folding back upon itself in patterns that resembled writing in languages no one spoke anymore. Then the surface of the water revealed something that shouldn't have been there. Currents dividing toward the interior, winding like the veins of some enormous creature asleep beneath the ground. A delta, she murmured. The word fell into the silence like a stone into a bottomless well. Alexander followed her gaze, and the gleam in his eyes was not mere curiosity. It was recognition, as though he had seen this before, in some dream that had jolted him awake with his heart racing for no apparent reason. Before the sun had fully established itself, Alexander called his men with a voice that left no room for doubt, and yet, strangely, left no room for fear either. Ready the boats. We follow this course, see how far the river wishes to take us. The sailors moved with the efficiency of those who have learned that uncertainty is simply courage waiting for a name. Helena distributed provisions and mooring lines with precise hands, while Makeda, accompanied by Amina, pressed forward with that enthusiasm that only exists in hearts not yet broken enough to stop believing in miracles. When the oars touched the water for the first time, the sound reverberated like a chant, deep, long, ancient. the involuntary baptism of something that had no name yet but already existed. The delta opened before them in multiple arms, like a labyrinth drawn by an intelligence that was not human. The air grew fresher with each stroke, and the distant sound of the sea, that constant roar that is at once threat and promise, gave way to the murmur of birds and the rustling of leaves that seemed to stir not with wind, but with something more. The river was wide and gentle, receiving the intruders with the patience of millennia. Helena touched the surface of the water with her fingertips and felt the coolness move through her entire body like an electric current, not unpleasant, but final, like a recognition. "These waters hold memory," she said quietly. Alexander smiled, and there was something dark and beautiful in that smile. "Then let us write the first verse into them." In that instant, the delta became not merely a landscape, but an open book whose pages were still blank and waiting. And to you who follow this crossing, who feel the wind of ancient stories touch your soul as though they were your own, I leave a simple but essential request. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share in the comments what this moment stirs within you. Every gesture of yours is like a flame lit in this bonfire that unites hearts across time and space. In doing so, you don't merely strengthen this journey, you make it possible. Because, like the sailors of the Alethea, you too blow with us upon the sails of destiny. The story continues, but it is your presence that keeps the fire burning and the sea awake. The river led them through rushes and flooded trees, where sunlight filtered through in golden reflections that didn't illuminate, they revealed. At every bend, a new landscape. A blue-plumed bird perched on a rock like a sentinel, a field blanketed in moss that muffled the sound of the oars, a bank of pale stone marked by grooves that could have been erosion, or could have been something else. The silence that settled over the group was the kind that doesn't invite conversation. It invites contemplation. Alexander knew with a certainty that required no explanation that they stood at the threshold of something that surpassed any notion of camp or port. They were being guided. The question no one voiced aloud was, why now, and by whom? The Island of Mists and the First Breath of Hope. No one spoke when the island appeared. There were no words for it. The boats moved slowly through the calm waters of the delta when the mist began to behave in an impossible way, rising in columns around a solid form at the center of the river, like arms shielding something precious. The fog did not reveal the island. It presented it with the silent ceremony of a secret being finally entrusted. Helena, at the front, leaned toward the water, and the reflections she saw on the liquid surface were not merely the sky. They were images rising from below, from a time deeper than any human memory could reach. The air was sweet, laden with an earthy fragrance that spoke of fertility and of promises that had existed before there were ever mouths to make them. And then Makeda pointed east, and everyone saw it, an island bathed in light that did not come from the sun. That came from within. "There," said Alexander. Just that. But the weight of those two syllables was the weight of a decision that could not be undone. The group drew closer with the caution of those who understand that certain thresholds, once crossed, forever change the person who crosses them. The shores were of dark, fine sand, scattered with small bluish stones that appeared polished by hands, not by the sea. The tall, lush vegetation bowed beneath the morning dew like figures making a reverence. The first to leap ashore was Tiberio, a man whose gaze had witnessed enough storms to fear nothing any longer. And yet, upon touching the ground of that island, he hesitated for a fraction of a second. Amina tested the terrain with the light steps of one who knows the difference between soil and threshold. Helena and Makeda followed close behind. The ground yielded beneath their feet, not like ordinary sand, but like something that breathed. "It's fertile," said Tiberio. in a voice that tried to sound practical and could not conceal its wonder. "This earth accepts the touch of man." Alexander knelt and took a handful of soil in his hands. He let it run through his fingers with deliberate slowness, as though reading something written in those dark particles. "Soft, moist, full of life," he murmured. And then, something more, in a voice so low that only Helena heard it, as though someone had prepared it for us. Their eyes met, and in the silence between them, an agreement was sealed that required no words, because words would have diminished the weight of that moment. All around, the crew spread across the island with the care of those exploring a temple, not a territory. A stream of crystalline water ran just a few meters away, feeding small lagoons where birds bathed without fear of the human presence, as though they knew these people had not come to take, but to belong. Makeda walked to the center of the island without anyone telling her to do so. It was as if her feet knew before her mind did. When she knelt, she closed her eyes for a long moment, and when she opened them, something was different in them. Not exactly sadness, not exactly joy, but that nameless emotion that arises when we recognize something we have never seen before. "I feel this land is alive," she said, "as though it has been waiting for us." Helena drew close and placed her hand on the young princess's shoulder with the tenderness of one who knows that certain discoveries are also a kind of grief. "Perhaps we are not only finding a home," she replied. "Perhaps we are being reminded of where we came from." The wind moved through the trees, and the leaves danced like the flags of a nation no one had ever truly forgotten, only ceased to remember. Amina, who watched in silence with that gaze that reaches what others cannot see, added, "The spirits of the earth have approved our arrival." No one argued. No one needed to. At noon, with the sun at its peak and the shadows at their smallest, as though time itself were compressed into that single instant, Alexander gathered the group. In his voice, there was something that was not merely resolve, it was conviction. The difference between the two is immense and rarely visible from the outside. "This island will be our home," he announced. "Here we will build the first refuge, not just for ourselves, for all who seek shelter from the storms that men create for one another." Tiberio raised his arm, and the gesture carried the weight of an oath. Then Alexander drove the Alethea's standard into the ground, the sun intertwined with the star, a symbol few fully understood, but that everyone felt. The wind blew hard, and the embers of the improvised fire lifted into golden sparks that rose too high to be merely sparks. And everyone understood, each in their own way, that they were not simply planting a flag. They were answering a call that had been made long before any of them were born. As the afternoon began to fall, the sky took on shades that appear in no human palette, rose and lilac, and something between the two that exists only in skies that bear witness to unrepeatable moments. The river reflected that light like a road of fire. Helena moved among the men, raising the first tents, distributing not only water but something that has no name, and yet everyone recognizes when they receive it, the certainty that they are not alone. Alexander watched from a distance with that quiet pride, which is the most dangerous of feelings, because it announces that something precious is being built, and precious things always draw the storms. The sound of hammering mingled with the laughter of the sailors and the spontaneous singing of Makeda, a melody no one had taught her, and for that very reason, probably the most truthful that island had ever heard. Thus was born, without formal ceremony and with all the solemnity in the world, the spark of what one day would be called Concarneau. The dream of a port and the first ordeals. The problem with dreams is that they must be built with hands, and hands bleed. The days that followed were marked by a rhythm of creation that carried, hidden within its cadence, the first warning of a truth no one wanted to face. To build is also to destroy the previous version of yourself. The mornings began with the sound of hammers and the rustle of cut thatch, sounds that seemed simple and that gradually revealed a disconcerting complexity. The makeshift tents gave way to shelters of solid timber, and the air filled with smells that were, at once, promise and effort. Turned earth, fresh clay, bread baked over embers that had to be divided into portions smaller than any stomach desired. Alexander directed, helped, decided, and at night he stood gazing at the river for far too long for a man who wasn't troubled by something. Helena oversaw the storing of provisions with the precision of one who knows that abundance is always more fragile than it appears. Everything worked, and it was precisely that efficiency that was beginning to unsettle, because fractures don't appear where things break. They appear where everything seems a little too perfect. Scarcity arrived without announcing itself, as it always does. Tools that were missing, suitable timber that couldn't be found, men accustomed to the open freedom of the sea who were beginning to look at the rising walls of the settlement with the expression of someone realizing for the first time that they were being enclosed, not by enemies, but by a choice. "The ocean demands no waiting," said one of them, and in his voice there was not merely complaint, but philosophy. "The land forces us to learn patience." Alexander listened and recognized in the other man's words his own nighttime thoughts. He too felt the absence of the wind cutting through the sails, of the salt on his lips, of the untamable freedom of open water. At night, when silence lay down over the island, the distant sound of the waves arrived with the persistence of a name being called by someone who knows exactly where you are hiding. Helena perceived the restlessness with the clarity of one who had developed over years the ability to see what people feel before they themselves notice it. And at the same time, she saw what they could not, the structures taking shape on the horizon, the crops germinating with a stubbornness that was almost human, the laughter of children who had been born at sea and were now learning that land could be a home too. "The land has its own tides," she said to Alexander on one of those nights when the fire crackled between them like a third presence. "They don't move with water, they move with time." He smiled, but it was the smile that belongs to people who understand perfectly what has been said and who, for that very reason, grow even more unsettled. They were learning to navigate in an entirely different way, and the question no one voiced aloud was, for how long? One afternoon, with the sun hanging low over the delta like a hesitant promise, Tiberio approached Alexander with that gait old men use when they carry a truth they would rather not have to bear. "Captain," he said, "some are thinking of moving on. They say the sea is their home, that here they have fulfilled what they could." The dilemma Alexander had been dodging like a sailor dodges a submerged rock materialized before him in all its silent brutality. Stay and consolidate the collective dream, or leave and honor the particular calling that pulsed in his chest with the regularity of a second heart. "Each man must follow the call he feels," he answered, with a steadiness that cost more than it appeared. "This is no rupture, Tiberio. It is the freedom that keeps men bound together." The old sailor nodded slowly. In that gesture lived all the wisdom of someone who had watched men destroy what they loved by trying to hold on to it by force. That night, Helena gathered everyone around the fire without anyone needing to be called twice, because in her voice, at that moment, there was something that went beyond authority and reached a deeper place, the kind of truth people recognize even before they understand it. "The earth beneath our feet has accepted us," she said, her voice steady over the crackling of the flames. "But it is also testing us, and it does not test our strength, it tests our unity." The fire reflected in her eyes with an intensity that made even the most skeptical feel, for an instant, that they stood before something that could not be reduced to simple words. Makeda, seated beside Amina, absorbed every syllable like someone learning a language that is, at once, entirely new and strangely familiar. She understood, for the first time, that courage lies not only in facing what frightens you, it lies in remaining when the heart most desires to leave. When everyone had withdrawn, Alexander and Helena stayed watching the fire die, that slow transformation of flames into embers that is perhaps the most honest metaphor nature offers for love. "There is something eternal in this moment," she said. "We are not only founding a port, we are founding a way of existing in the world." He held her hand, a simple gesture that carried the weight of everything that had gone unsaid. "But one day the sea will call again." Helena smiled with the smile of someone who already knew the answer before the question. "And when that happens, we will go. But we will leave behind what we are and what we have learned to be." Far away, the ocean answered with a soft murmur. Or perhaps it was agreement. There was no way to know for certain, and that was precisely what made the moment perfect. The tensions of the land and the call of the sea. There was a war being waged in Concarneau, and no one had declared it. The days that followed brought the specific weight of repeated effort, not the dramatic effort of storms, but that other kind, more treacherous, that accumulates in small gestures until, suddenly, the body refuses to obey without apparent explanation. The construction pressed forward, the crops grew, and beneath that surface harmony, something invisible and powerful moved like an underwater current, the kind of force that makes no sound but is capable of sinking ships. The men of the sea looked at the walls of the settlement with expressions that tried to be neutral and could not manage it. "We were made to sail," they said, "not to work the soil." Alexander listened and understood, not with his mind, but with that part of the body that sits below the chest and above the stomach, where inconvenient truths settle before any thought takes shape. "Every voyage needs a port," he would answer, "even if only to learn how to set sail again." But there were nights when, alone, he knew he was repeating those words to himself as much as to the others. Helena watched the conflict grow with the sharpened perception of one who has learned that the most devastating wars are those no one admits are happening. Many longed for open water. Others, exhausted in a way that rest could not cure, saw in the land a chance for a new beginning that the sea could never offer. Makeda observed both sides with the intensity of someone who knows this tension does not belong only to these men. It belongs to her as well, to any human being who carries within themselves two opposing callings with equal force. "Men are like the sea," she said to Amina, in one of those moments of clarity that arrive without warning. "Some prefer the waves, others the depths." The guardian answered without hesitation. "And there are still those who live between the tides, never settling into either." The metaphor landed on Makeda like a stone falling slowly, and when it touched the bottom, it echoed. Then the rain came. Not the good rain, the kind the earth asks for. The other kind, the kind the earth is not yet prepared to receive. Low clouds covered the sky with the speed of a decision made by forces that do not consult human beings, and the settlement became a labyrinth of mud that revealed with the most ruthless efficiency every choice that had been made too quickly or too slowly. The crops suffered. The shelters, still too young to have learned how to hold firm, gave way. Alexander walked the damage with that particular calm of leaders who have already understood that despair is a luxury no one in a position of responsibility can afford. "It won't be the first or the last trial," he said, as he drove stakes into the ground with hands that had not yet fully healed from the last storm. Tiberio, beside him, with the serenity of an oracle who would rather be wrong. "The sea punishes with waves. The land punishes with time." Both knew the real trial was not the rain, it was what the rain revealed about the will to remain. At night, The settlement seemed suspended between the steam of the fires and the smell of wet timber, that specific odor of things that have not yet decided between rotting and transforming. Helena moved between the tents, carrying blankets and that presence which is, at times, more useful than any remedy. When she returned to the shelter she shared with Alexander, she found him seated before the fire, studying the reflection of the flames in the blade of his sword, with an attention that belonged not to a warrior, but to a seer. "I feel the sea watching me," he confessed, without turning his face. "Like an old friend waiting for news, uncertain whether it will be good." Helena sat beside him, unhurried. "Perhaps the sea doesn't want to take you away," she said, in a voice so low it could be mistaken for the crackling of the fire. "Perhaps it only wants to remind you that it still exists inside you, and that this is not a betrayal of this place. It is honesty." Alexander remained silent for a long time, and that silence, which in another person would have been an answer, in him was only the beginning of a question that had not yet found its shape. When the storm relented, because all storms relent eventually, though never when we would wish them to, the sun returned with the generous arrogance of those who know they will be welcomed regardless of how long they have been away. The wheat began to appear, timid and firm at once, like a statement made in a quiet voice precisely because it needs no volume to be true. Helena organized the first harvest with the efficiency of one who transforms work into ritual. The bread baked that afternoon was shared in silence, with that spontaneous solemnity that surfaces when people collectively recognize they have crossed something that might have divided them and did not. "We are alive," she said, "and that for now is enough." Makeda smiled, but her gaze had already traveled beyond the walls of the settlement, beyond the banks of the delta, beyond what any human eye could reach. The wind was changing direction, and when the wind changes, the story changes with it. That clear night, with the sea shimmering beneath the moonlight as though the ocean floor were trying to communicate something urgent through its reflection, Alexander stood alone on the shore. Helena found him there after some time, and the silence they shared before words was the kind of silence that exists only between people who have already said everything that mattered and now are content with presence alone. "Do you believe this is our final destination?" she asked at last. He took his time answering, the kind of time that is not hesitation, but respect for the magnitude of what must be said. "No," he said. "This is the place where we learned the value of staying. The final destination has no name yet." The sea answered with a soft roar, not threatening, but final, like a renewed promise. The call had returned, not with the urgency of longing, but with the cold, luminous certainty of prophecy. The decisions and the legacy of Concarneau. The moment that every foundation fears more than any storm had arrived. The moment when the founders must decide whether to stay or to leave, and discover that both choices cost the same price. Concarneau breathed, for the first time, like a collective body with a rhythm of its own. Fires lit before dawn, the sound of the improvised mill marking time with its mechanical heart regularity, the scent of bread spreading through the mornings like an announcement of permanence. The delta ran serene, reflecting the sun with the glorious indifference of beautiful things that require no witnesses to go on being beautiful. And beneath that harmony, something invisible moved with the precision of a tide that has already decided where it is going. Alexander walked the riverbanks with that look Helena knew how to read. Not sadness, not regret, but that particular melancholy of those who sense that every gesture of construction is, at the same time, a gesture of farewell. The same wind that bent the wheat stalks carried, from exactly the right direction, the unmistakable murmur of the ocean, calling him by name, and calling her by name. Tiberio chose his moment with the precision of one who understands that the timing of a conversation can be more decisive than its content. "Captain," he said, with the serenity of those who have traveled roads too long to be troubled by what they find at the end of them, "the settlement grows, the crops flourish, the men think of families and children who will be born here without ever needing to know what it is to have the horizon as their only home." A pause. "Perhaps the time for sailing is not the same for all of us," Alexander answered without hesitation, but with that steadiness that costs a great deal and is worth a great deal for that very reason. "My path is to open seas. Yours is to guard them." The old sailor smiled with all the dignity of someone who receives a truth he already knew but needed to hear spoken aloud. "Then let me guard this land. You go, but your name stays rooted here, like wheat roots that no storm can tear out." Their hands met for an instant, and that instant was worth more than any oath. Helena watched the movement of the settlement with that tender melancholy that has no name in any language she knew, but that she recognized in her chest with the precision of someone who has learned that the truest feelings frequently exceed the human capacity to name them. In the women kneading bread, she saw the same hands that had gripped ropes and oars. In the children playing in the river, she saw the image of an entire generation that would never need to know what it means to be lost at open sea with no way of knowing whether land lies in any direction. And yet, at night, she confessed what she had been concealing with the discipline of one who knows that certain truths, told before their time, can destroy what they are trying to preserve. "As much as I love this land, and I do, Alexander, with a love I never expected to feel for any fixed place, my gaze cannot stop searching for the horizon. Makeda holds me to what we promised, the dances of the gods in the skies of Thule." He looked at her in silence, and the memory of that oath, which had been sleeping beneath the surface of every day built in Concarneau, awoke, not with urgency, but with the inevitability of things we have always known were coming. The following morning, Alexander and Helena gathered the settlers in the central square without prior notice, and everyone came because there was something in the summons that needed no words to communicate its weight. Alexander spoke with the rare combination of firmness and gentleness that distinguishes true leaders from those who merely hold authority. "Every man and woman here has the sacred right to choose their own path. Those who stay will have Concarneau as their home. Those who leave will have the sea as their home. Neither choice is lesser than the other. Both are ways of honoring the same destiny, to live with courage enough to be faithful to what you are." The silence that followed had the specific texture of what precedes irrevocable decisions. It was Tiberio who broke it, stepping forward with the simple solemnity of those who require no dramatic gestures to be monumental. "I stay, and I will guard this port the way one guards a memory that cannot be erased, with my whole body for all the time that remains to me." His words broke something in several people at once, and what broke was not fragility. It was the last resistance to genuine emotion. Helena took the floor with that voice she reserved for moments when words must do the work of time, must last, must endure after the voice that spoke them has already gone. This place was born of encounter, not of separation. Every stone, every crop, every gesture here carries a sacred intention. And when we leave, and we will leave, we will not do so in flight or in forgetting. We will leave out of faithfulness to what we are. The sea is part of our spirit, and it will bless this land as long as there is someone here who still looks toward the horizon and feels that they belong to it as well. There were men who wept without shame. There were others who raised their hands in gestures that were, at once, promise and farewell. Concarneau ceased to be merely a settlement in that moment. It became a symbol of something that does not fit entirely into any single word, but that everyone present recognized in the specific resonance of their own chests. At night, with the stars lighting the firmament one by one, as though someone were carefully deciding which witnesses to summon for that final shared instant, Alexander and Helena sat before the fire with the silence of those who no longer need words to understand each other, but who find in words, even so, a way of honoring what they have lived. "They will be all right," said Helena, and it was not comfort, it was conviction. "And so will we," answered Alexander, "because no home is entirely lost when one leaves part of one's heart in it." In the distance, Makeda gazed at the sea with eyes that had already passed through its surface and were seeing something else on the other side. Amina prepared their belongings in silence, with the serene competence of someone trained for movement and who had found in it not only destiny, but identity. And so, beneath the glow of the fire and the scent of the night that mingled salt and earth and something with no name that every sailor recognizes as promise, Concarneau stood firm, the first sacred port and the point of departure for a crossing that could not yet be named because it was still being invented. The farewell of the winds and the oath of departure. There are mornings that arrive with intention. That was one of them. The dawn of the day of farewell did not come gradually, the way ordinary dawns do, those that ease in along the edges of the horizon with the timidity of things uncertain of their own arrival. This dawn opened in golden bands with the definitive clarity of revelations. The entire sky split with light above the river, as though the sun itself had decided it would not miss that moment for anything. The camp was no longer a handful of tents or even a young settlement. It was a living organism with its own rhythm and memory, pulsing with the scent of bread and barley mingled into the damp morning air. Helena woke before the sun and walked the riverbanks without hurry, observing the marks in the sand, not those she had made the previous night, but all the others, those of the first uncertain days, those of the moments of crisis, those of the instants when someone had stopped at exactly that spot and stood looking at the river, trying to decide whether to stay or to go. "Nothing is lost when love has been planted," she murmured, and the breeze that touched her face was too warm for the hour, like a confirmation of something with no apparent origin. Alexander prepared the ships with that methodical precision which was, for him, the most honest form of prayer. The Aletheia gleamed beneath the first sun as though it had been built specifically for that instant. Its white sails spread like the wings of something that had not yet learned that flight must end. Beside it, the moonlit oasis rocked with the serenity of things that have no doubts about what they are. Makeda moved back and forth with a restless heart visible in the rhythm of her steps. She helped with the preparations, but her attention was fixed on a point on the horizon that no one else could see. "Thule is calling me," she said to Amina, in a voice so low it could have been a thought. The guardian answered without hesitation, "And we will answer, princess. The wind that calls is not the same as the wind that pushes. It is the one that welcomes." Both knew, with that knowing that precedes any proof, and for that reason is the most solid of all, that destiny had not yet finished revealing itself. It had, in truth, merely completed its first sentence. At the center of the settlement, a circle formed around the fire with the naturalness of things that were inevitable. Men, women, children, all with eyes shining from that specific combination of joy and loss that has no name in any language because, perhaps, it should not have one. Tiberio brought a jug of river water with the solemnity of a priest who knows that the most powerful rituals are those invented at the moment they are needed, not those inherited from traditions that no longer remember their own origins. "Before you depart," he said, with the deep voice of those who speak to the future as much as to the present, "drink from the waters that united us, so that you may never forget where you began." Alexander took the jug, raised it to the sky with both hands, a gesture he had not planned, and for that very reason was completely true, and declared, "We drink from the same river. The same sea awaits us. May every drop that touches our lips today remind us that we are made of the same crossing, and that the crossing has not yet reached its final chapter. He passed the jug to Helena. She smiled more with her eyes than with her mouth, and the fire reflected in everyone's eyes at once. The ceremony that followed was in no plan. It emerged as true things emerge, with the impossible precision of improvisations that appear rehearsed because they arise from a place deeper than any rehearsal could reach. Children offering flowers gathered from the riverbanks, women singing in different languages that, mingled together, created something that was neither and yet contained them all. Drums marking a beat that was, at once, march and lament and celebration. Because certain farewells are all of these things at the same time. Helena placed upon the fire a white shell and a blue stone. "The sea and the land," she said, "may they always meet in harmony, even when one forgets the other." Makeda cast into the fire a bracelet woven of golden straw, the one she had brought from her father's palace. "May the light of friendship never be extinguished, not even when there are no eyes to see it." The flame crackled, and a sudden breeze lifted the smoke toward the sea in an exact line. A sign, some said. The others simply looked and knew. When the sun began to decline, that specific hour when light ceases to be illumination and becomes presence, Alexander gathered those who would be departing with the calm of one who has made peace with the impossibility of answering all callings at once. "It is not farewell that separates us," he said, and in his voice there was not only conviction, it was that rare combination of sorrow and freedom that surfaces when a human being stops fighting against the nature of what they are. It is the absence of purpose, and our purpose is to follow. Like the river that has no choice but to go forward, and for that very reason is what it is. Tiberio stepped close and placed in Alexander's hands a small wooden box with inlays he had never seen before. "Inside it," said the old man, "is a handful of the earth of Concarneau, so that the winds will know where you come from when they do not know where you are going." Alexander pressed the box to his chest with a force that was not only of the hands. "And I leave you, Tiberio, the helm of what we began, not as a burden, as an honor." Their hands met one last time, and that simple gesture carried the weight of everything that exists on no map. The late afternoon bathed the settlement in copper and gratitude as the vessels began to move, pushed by the rising tide that arrived with the punctuality of forces that do not consult human emotions before doing their work. Helena, on the deck of the Alethea, turned and stood watching the houses, the fields, the river, the people who had become, through effort and choice and failure and reconstruction, a community, a home, something she hadn't known could exist until it did. "They will keep growing," she said, and in her voice there was not only conviction, but something approaching gratitude for the wonder itself. Alexander, at the helm, nodded with the serenity of those who have understood that to leave is not the opposite of belonging. When the first beat of the drum sounded from the shore, Tiberio, most likely, marking the departure with the same precision with which he had marked every difficult decision. The sails filled, and the ships began to pull away. Concarneau gleamed beneath the last flames of the shore fires, and the people waved with torches that flickered like stars that do not know they are stars. The oath of departure was sealed in that instant. To leave what you love is not loss. It is the most demanding and most complete form of continuing to love. The farewell to the promised land and the return to the waters. The sea did not receive them with enthusiasm. It received them with indifference, which is, for the ocean, the highest form of respect. The sound of the sails tearing through the air mingled with the particular lament of rising tides. That sound, which is neither joyful nor sorrowful, but contains both, like a chord that does not resolve. The Alethea, and the moonlit oasis drew away from the cove where Concarneau had been born with the deliberate slowness of those who know there will be no other moment quite like this one, and who, for that very reason, must hold every detail with the greatest attention a human being can sustain before emotion overwhelms memory. From the shore, the people waved with torches, small flames flickering like stars that had landed on the sand to say their farewells in person. Helena, at the prow, kept her eyes dry with the effort of someone who had decided that tears would come later, in some private moment that had not yet arrived. "It's strange," she murmured, "to leave knowing we are leaving behind something that belongs to us, without belonging to us." Alexander, without turning his eyes from the horizon opening before them, like a promise that had not yet revealed its contents. Perhaps everything we create is like that, part of us, and yet free to be more than us. Makeda did not cry. She stood watching the coastline disappear with that expression poets try to describe and never quite manage because it exists precisely in the space between words. "I never thought," she said to Amina, in the voice of someone making a discovery and putting it into words at the same moment, "that the heart could love the land and the sea with equal intensity, without betraying either one." Amina answered, leaning against the railing with that posture of someone completely present even when they appear distant. "It is because both are mirrors, princess. The land shows us where we take root. The sea shows us how far we can go. We need both to fully know who we are." Makeda nodded, but the wind brought her a shiver that was not from the cold. It was one of those premonitions that arrive before they can be understood. Amina noticed. She said nothing. She knew that certain emotions need no translation. Destiny, when it is ready, finds its own language. The distance grew, and with it, the mist that began to rise like a curtain the ocean was using to close one act and prepare the next. The outline of Concarneau disappeared in stages, first the details, then the shapes, then the last light of the fires, until the world became once again only sea and sky, and the impossible line between them that sailors call the horizon, but that mystics call something else. Alexander held the helm with hands that knew their work by heart, and in that familiarity there was a kind of comfort that the land, for all its beauty, had never been entirely able to offer. The wind blowing from the south carried a distant sound, something between chant and calling, between invitation and warning. Helena closed her eyes and listened with her whole body. "It is the sea welcoming us back," she said at last, without resentment, only patience. And the ocean received them as it always receives those who return carrying something they did not have when they left, without ceremony, but with recognition. On the second night, the sky seemed to have been expanded by some force that does not answer to human measures. The stars shone with that intensity that only appears on nights that have something to say, and their reflections on the sea formed a luminous path that began at Alexander's feet and vanished into the horizon with no apparent end. Helena pointed to a particular star, not the brightest, but the most constant, the one that did not tremble with the wind as the others did. "The same one that guided us when we left Hispania," she said. "It still travels with us." Alexander smiled with his mouth and his eyes, and with something deeper than either. "Then let it remain our lighthouse." A lighthouse does not choose whom it shines for. It simply shines. Makeda, behind them, listened to the exchange without joining it, feeling grow within her a certainty she could not yet name. That destiny is not measured by the point of departure, but by the heart's willingness to follow even when the map ends abruptly in the middle of a sentence. On the third day, the waters began to change with that gradualness nature uses when it is preparing a revelation, not with the brutality of a storm, but with the gentle insistence of something that must be perceived before it can be understood. The deep blue gave way to shades of green, and schools of luminous fish appeared around the vessels with the steady faithfulness of guides who had not been asked but who arrived regardless. Amina, enchanted, followed their movement with her eyes. "It is as though the ocean knows who we are," she said. Helena answered without hesitation. "It knows. It has always known. The ocean holds the memory of everything that has ever crossed it, and we have crossed it more than once." Alexander, attentive to signs the others had not yet learned to read, noticed that the wind was now blowing from the north, the same wind that, on other voyages, had pushed the Alethea toward the Pillars of Hercules. "We are returning to the root of the gods," he said, not fully knowing the weight of what he was declaring. The sea, in its language that uses no words but never fails to be understood by those willing to listen, was already showing them the next chapter. When night deepened and the crew rested, that particular sleep of those who work with their bodies, and who, for that very reason, sleep with a completeness that those who work only with their minds rarely know, Alexander remained on deck alone, or nearly. Helena arrived without a sound, draping the cloak over his shoulders with the natural gesture of someone who has done this so many times that the gesture has ceased to be an action and become a language. "What does destiny hold for us now?" she asked, gazing at the dark horizon. Alexander took his time, because certain answers deserve the time it takes for them to arrive. "The chance to find out," he said at last. "Always the same thing, always different." He raised his eyes to the firmament and added, with that quietness that is more intimate than any intensity, "And this time, we will seek not only lands, we will seek signs from the sky itself." The words dissolved into the night wind, and the wind answered with a long, deep whistle, as though the gods had decided to acknowledge receipt. The signs of the sky and the return of the northern lights. There was something different about the light of that dawn, and the difference was not visible. It was felt. The fourth day at sea brought a silence of a quality that the older sailors recognized and that the younger ones had not yet developed the vocabulary to describe. The wind had ceased with the abruptness of a decision made by a greater intelligence, and the ocean lay motionless beneath a translucent veil that was neither fog nor the absence of fog. It was something else. The Alethea glided over those waters carried only by inertia and the memory of motion, as though the vessel itself were dreaming. Helena was the first to sense the change, not in her eyes, but in her whole body, that kind of perception that precedes any thought. The horizon had shifted in tone. The characteristic blue had become silver, and the air carried a fragrance that was not maritime. It was mineral, almost ethereal, like the air of places that exist between what is and what could be. "The North is awakening," she said, in a voice that blended reverence with that particular quality of awe which is not fear, but is something far closer to the divine than most people come in a lifetime. Makeda climbed to the deck with her hair stirred by a wind that did not seem to blow from any particular direction, or perhaps blew from all of them at once. "The air is dancing," she murmured, in the voice of someone describing the invisible using the only words available, which are never enough. Amina stepped to the railing and touched the surface of the water with her fingertips, and a soft radiance spread from the point of contact, as though the water held light inside it and the human touch had set it free. "The sea is breathing light," she said, with that wonder which is the most honest response to the extraordinary. Alexander felt a shiver move through him from the back of his neck to the base of his spine, not from cold, but from recognition. The phenomenon was not natural in the common sense of the word, or it was natural in a way that human nature had not yet learned to classify. "Do not be afraid," said Helena, and the steadiness of her voice was the steadiness of someone speaking from a certainty she could not trace to any source but did not question. "These are the winds of the north. They recognize us. They remember us the way they remember all who came before." When night arrived, and it arrived as northern nights do, with a speed that allows no time for preparation. The sky began to pulse, green and violet, and something between the two that exists in no palette human beings have ever invented. The boreal lights danced above the mast of the Aletheia with the autonomy of things that possess their own consciousness, like living curtains moved by a wind that touched nothing else around them. The sailors knelt with the specific humility of those who find themselves before the irreducible. Makeda, by contrast, raised her hands to the sky and laughed, that laughter which is pure and for that very reason more courageous than any calculated act of bravery. "They are dancing," she said. "The gods feasting in the firmament." Helena, beside her, touched her shoulder with a tenderness that was also instruction. "They do not only dance, Makeda. They guide us. Each color is a sign, each movement a direction that cannot be transcribed on any human map. Listen, the sky has something to say." The wind returned with a force that carried something magnetic, not the ordinary wind that pushes sails, but a force that seemed to emerge from the interior of things. The sails filled with a sound that existed on the boundary between the audible and the felt, and the Aletheia resumed speed with the confidence of vessels that recognize the way even when the way is not visible. Alexander studied the constellations with the attention of someone reading a text in a language they know but have not practiced in a long time. That cautious familiarity, that fear of mistranslating what is essential. "It is not the sea we are following," he said at last. "It is the sky." Helena agreed, and her eyes reflected the colors of the aurora borealis with an intensity that was not merely reflection, it was resonance. Every star is a thought, Alexander. When we learn to feel instead of only to calculate, they cease to be above us. They become mirrors of what vibrates within. He smiled, a slow smile, belonging to someone who has just understood something they were on the verge of losing simply because they could not find the right angle from which to see it. Then Thule is not distant. It is within those who dare to see it. In the early hours before dawn, the cold intensified with the conviction of temperatures that know what they are doing. The crew worked wrapped in cloaks with expressions that physical hardship had purified of any performance, only true faces, bathed in the boreal light that made the familiar strange and the strange sacred. Makeda could not take her eyes from the firmament, with that kind of attention that exhausts the body but feeds something deeper. "Helena," she said without turning her face, "this is what my soul was searching for. It always was. The dances my father described in the stories of my childhood, I thought they were metaphor." Helena smiled with that tenderness we reserve for discoveries made too late not to feel the weight of lost time, but early enough that they still matter. What we seek outside is always the reflection of what already pulses within, Princess. The sky only reveals what the heart has already learned to dream before it had words for it. When the first ray of sunlight broke the horizon, the entire sea transformed into liquid gold with that intensity that makes people stop and forget, for an instant, that they have anything else to do besides exist. Alexander held the helm with hands that were cold but steady, and breathed in the northern air with the depth of someone who carries a decision within and breathes it for the first time as reality, not as possibility. We are on the right path. Not a question, not a hope. Certainty, that specific kind which does not eliminate risk but makes it bearable. Helena placed her hand over his. The sea changes, the currents change, the wind changes, the purpose remains. In the distance, a line of mist rose from the horizon with the impossible geometry of things that exist between worlds. Indistinct, mysterious, more real for it. "There," said Alexander, and in that single syllable lived the full weight of every "there" they had spoken across the length of that journey. The sails spread wide in the northern wind, and the vessels pressed onward, guided by lights that belonged not to the world of calculation, but to the destiny of those who dare to sail beyond what can be proven. The omen of the waters and the invisible voice. The silence of that morning had weight, literally, as though the air had thickened during the night and refused to move until something was understood. The sea lay motionless as a mirror of obsidian, and its stillness was not the ordinary calm. It was the specific stillness of things on the verge of speaking. The wind had ceased entirely, and the sound of the oars echoed through the arrested air with the brutal clarity of things that have nothing else to muffle them. Every stroke, every plunge, every withdrawal from the water sounding like syllables of a word that had not yet been fully spoken. Helena felt the change before any thought arrived. Not in the sky, not in the water, but in her own body. A shiver that began at the base of her spine and rose with the precision of a diagnosis. The air around her was vibrating, not as hot air vibrates, not as wind-stirred air vibrates, but as air vibrates when something without physical form is passing through it. "Something is rising from the depths," she murmured. Alexander raised his eyes from the helm. In Helena's gaze there was something he had learned to recognize over the years. Not fear, but that perception she sometimes had of things not yet visible that would inevitably become so. The ocean, in all its vastness, seemed now on the verge of revealing something it had kept since before there were human beings to keep secrets. The phenomenon began with the reflection. The colors that had danced in the sky on previous nights, those greens and violets that belonged to no human palette, began to descend in spirals onto the water, touching the surface and not stopping there, continuing downward, transforming the ocean into a mosaic of impossible tones that pulsed with the regularity of something alive. It was not reflection, it was emanation. The crew gathered at the railings with that specific mixture of fascination and terror that surfaces when the magnitude of something surpasses any available category for classifying it. "It is a portal," whispered Makeda, her eyes fixed on the surface that breathed with a rhythm that belonged to no wave. Amina drew close, feeling the warmth radiating from the air around those spirals, warmth that should not have existed in those northern waters. "Not a portal, princess," she answered, with the serenity of those who recognize what others name incorrectly. "A mirror. The sea is showing us who we are, not who we were, who we are now, and who we will be if we have the courage to see it." The vessel began to behave in ways that defied the laws of wind and current. It advanced on its own in certain directions, slowed in others without visible explanation, as though being guided by hands that had no physical dimension but possessed clear intention. "It is not wind," said Alexander, with the voice of someone describing the impossible with the same objectivity they would use to describe a storm. "These are tides that do not obey the laws of the world we know." Helena stepped to the helm without a word and placed her hands over his. The temperature of the metal beneath her palms was strange, neither cold nor warm, but something that existed at no point on any known scale. "Let the sea lead," she said in a tone so low it was nearly internal. "The path now is traced neither with the body nor with calculations. It is traced with the soul, and the soul knows the way even when the mind has not yet seen it." Alexander closed his eyes, and the Aletheia, as though it had been waiting for precisely that surrender, vibrated. The entire hull, from one end to the other, like a string that recognizes the note that belongs to it. When night sealed the firmament in silver mists that erased the line between sky and ocean, Helena sat at the prow, wrapped in cloaks that could not entirely keep out the cold, but that kept the cold from being the most present thing in that moment. She watched the reflections moving in the water with the specific quality of shadows that possess awareness. And then, the voice arrived. Not through the ears, through the mind, through the cells, through that channel which has no location in the body but that every human being recognizes when it is activated. A feminine voice, distant and close at once. that was not sound, but was more real than any sound Helena had ever heard. Daughter of the dawn, the gates of Thula do not open for the eyes. They open for the heart that has learned to be still enough to hear what has always been being said. Helena went completely motionless. She looked around. No one reacted, except Amina, who raised her face with closed eyes, as though the same internal breeze had touched her from a different direction. "Helena," said the guardian, in a voice trying to be steady and a fraction of a second from failing. "The ancients recognize you. They were waiting for you, not in this place, in this moment." The sea began to radiate, not to reflect, not to absorb, to radiate from the inside out, as though every molecule of water had simultaneously decided it was time to reveal its true nature. The faces of everyone on board were bathed in a luminescence that cast no shadows, because it came from every direction at once. The fear that had existed gave way to something that also has no name but might be called devotion. That specific state in which a human being perceives that they are in the presence of something that utterly surpasses them and finds in that not annihilation but liberation. Alexander watched Helena with the absolute attention of those who understand they are witnessing something that will not happen in precisely this way again. "Are you hearing what I hear?" he asked. She answered without taking her eyes from the glowing water. "Yes. And it does not come from outside. It is the echo of a time we have already inhabited, not a memory, but a reunion." The captain understood with that understanding which requires no logic. Thule was not a cartographic destination. It was ancestral remembrance. The ocean was not carrying them forward. It was making them remember what they were before they forgot. Then, with the impossible gentleness of revelations that arrive too early to have been expected and too late to be avoided, a wave rose before the Aletheia, not threatening but architectural, forming a translucent arch that contained within it reflections of landscapes that did not exist in that ocean. Lands covered in white ice that emitted its own light, mountains touching clouds that were not clouds, skies dancing with the complexity of those that have something urgent to communicate. Helena extended her hand and touched the air inside the arch, and felt warmth where there should have been cold, solidity where there should have been only light. "This is the threshold," she said, in a voice that barely existed. The invisible voice returned, closer this time, with that serene urgency of truths that wait for the right moment without ever losing patience. "Not all cross the veil. Some are called only to remember that the veil exists, and that to exist is already to be a form of crossing it." The arch dissolved with the slowness of a promise fulfilling itself. The sea returned. The silence returned. And Helena turned to Alexander with the eyes of someone who has arrived somewhere that has no coordinates yet. "This was not the moment to arrive," she said. "It was the moment to understand that arrival and departure are the same movement seen from different angles." The circle revealed and the baptism of Dovannes. There was something no navigational instrument could measure, the feeling of having been there before, not in the sense of memory, but in the deeper sense of recognition. Dawn rose serene over a sea that had returned to its usual appearance with the discretion of things that have revealed enough and now wait for the revelations to be digested. The Aletheia pressed forward with that post-storm quietude. Not that there had been a storm, but there had been something of equivalent intensity and inverse effect. Not destruction, but revelation. Alexander noticed first. It was the vegetation, that specific pattern of low-lying plants bent by the salt wind that he had seen before with a disturbing exactness. Then the fragrance, resin and seaweed in a combination that repeated itself nowhere else along any coastline he had sailed. Then the way the light touched the cliffs, at that angle that is not common, that seems to come from a direction the sun does not usually occupy. The stars of the last watch had drawn that pattern, He had thought he was reading the heavens incorrectly. He had been reading them correctly. "We are not returning," he said, in a voice that required care to utter. "We are reuniting." Helena approached without hurry, the kind of without hurry that belongs to someone who already knows what they will find and for that very reason allows themselves the luxury of arriving slowly. She studied the sand, the color of the stones, the way the foam behaved when it met those particular rocks. Every detail confirmed what she had, in some way, suspected but never formulated. "We did not travel in a straight line," she said, with the voice of someone naming a truth that existed before it was named. "We traveled in a circle." Alexander nodded, not with resignation, but with that specific acceptance which is harder to reach than any victory. The sea taught us, not where to go, how to recognize. The understanding that settled between them was neither immediate nor gradual. It was that third kind of understanding that happens when the mind stops resisting what the heart has known for some time. That land was not a repeated destination. It was a revealed territory. The same geographical body seen with eyes that, finally, had the right angle. Makeda smiled. Not the polished smile that royalty learns before learning anything else. That other one, rarer, that surfaces when a human being realizes that what seemed like defeat was, in truth, the only possible form of arrival. "The gods did not lead us astray," she said to Amina, and in her voice there was something far beyond ordinary human certainty. "They made us turn until we learned to see what had been before us from the very beginning." The guardian placed her hand on the princess's shoulder with that tenderness that is also instruction, that touch which transfers something words cannot. "Every return is a rite, princess, and every rite demands that the one who undergoes it be different from who they were when they entered it. When we recognize the cycle, when we stop calling transformation a loss, we cease to be prisoners of the path and become the path itself." The wind moved through the sails with the softness of a confirmation that required no volume to be final. Alexander ordered the approach to the cove with the serenity of someone making a decision that is not merely strategic, it is sacred. He gathered the crew on deck with the look of someone who has something important to say and who, for that very reason, will say it with the greatest possible simplicity. This place is not a return. It is not a mistake. It is a circle understood, and a circle understood is not a prison. It is a revelation, a pause, the kind of pause that great moments demand, the one that gives the word that follows the weight it deserves. We will call this land Douarnenez, where the path recognizes itself. The words fell into the silence of the deck with the precision of stones cast into still water, each one creating ripples that expanded beyond what was visible. This was not naming by conquest, it was naming by understanding. A covenant between human consciousness and the geography of the spirit, between the man who names and the land that consents to be named because it recognizes in that name something true about what it is. The vessels anchored, and everyone disembarked with that specific lightness that is not the absence of weight, but the presence of something that bears the weight from within. The beaches of Douarnenez stretched wide and bright beneath the sun, sheltered by gentle dunes that softened the wind and by ancient rocks that made the sea speak differently when it met them. The crew rested without needing to be given permission to rest. They simply stopped, with the naturalness of things that have arrived at the right moment. Fires were lit, cloaks spread out. The weariness that was not merely physical, the particular exhaustion of people who carry revelations while still learning to digest the previous ones, dissolved into the constant sound of the waves, which here had a different rhythm, not urgency, not appeal, only constant presence, like a heart that needs no announcement to demonstrate that it is still beating. That evening, the sun sinking into the horizon with the generosity of those who know they will return, Alexander stood motionless before the sea for a time that could not be measured with ordinary instruments. Helena sat beside him without asking if she could, because she had arrived at a place in life where certain presences require no permission. "We learned today," she said, after the silence that was necessary before words, "that to advance is not always to move forward." Alexander turned his face toward her with that look it had taken years to learn. Not the look of the captain or the explorer, but the look of the man who knows that the greatest navigation was never across the ocean. Sometimes to advance is to recognize that one has already arrived, not at a new place, but at a new understanding of a place that always existed. The wind moved through Dovernanez, and the flames of the fires swayed as though in agreement. There, beneath stars that had been seen before, but that now held meanings they had not held yesterday, the journey continued, not through the movement of the body, but through the irreversible expansion of consciousness. And that, they discovered on that evening, was the only crossing that truly mattered. In the next episode, on the hidden trails of the sacred mountains, where the air grows so thin that every breath is a choice and the silence has the texture of stone and prayer, Edith awaited them, not as a guide, but as the guardian of a portal that opens only when those who seek it have finally stopped seeking. Helena, Alexander, Makeda, and Amina will face not only the altitude and the cold that cuts like blades made of everything not yet understood, but the veils between the visible and the invisible that guard the chamber of the ancestors. That place where words that were never spoken in life continue to be spoken forever. In the depths where silence echoes like prayer, and ancient inscriptions pulse with a light that is neither torch nor sun, Helena will discover that Thula was never a horizon to be reached. It was always an interior portal waiting to be awakened. And awakenings, like all true transformation, exact the highest price that exists, the previous version of oneself. Between visions that connect what was to what is yet to be, trials that test not strength, but the willingness to surrender to what cannot be controlled, and revelations that will lead the group to question whether the longest crossing is the one that traverses seas or the one that traverses the heart itself, a final oath will be sealed. Not of arrival, but of eternal return to the mystery that pulses within every human being who refuses to call impossible what has simply not yet come to pass.